Okay, welcome back to New 302, March 11th, 2021. This is on the tower. I'm going to keep this relatively brief. So I'm going to try to keep it to like half an hour because I'm aware that there are a couple of other presentations and people are in the crunch elsewise. So I'm going to try to be very brief. So the tower. Like I said, there are a couple of interesting approaches that we can take to this. And so the first is talking about Jung's tower at Bollingen, right, in Switzerland. And the second is to talk about sort of the tower more generally. So I'm going to move through a bunch of that stuff. And yeah, we can kind of elaborate it as we go, but I think you'll see some sort of interesting connections in and around that. So starting with Jung's tower on Bollingen, right? Pretty famously, he decides he's going to build this thing. And it's very much seems to be sort of an outgrowth, if you're reading it in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, of this general sort of like construction thing that he had going on. He wanted to create himself like a little medieval scholar's tower. And really specifically, right, when he built it, it was designed to not have modern amenities, right? It didn't have electric light, it didn't have plumbing. Like it was a strange little medieval space for him, very atypical. Now, as I've said before, doing inner work maybe is slightly easier if you're married to one of the richest families in Switzerland, because it's like, well, I need to do inner work, so I'm going to build a castle. Okay, great. That's not available to everybody, but he starts out by building this first tower, and then as he goes, he expands it. He starts adding things, and he quite explicitly links this idea of the expansion of this structure, the expansion of this tower, to his own development, right? This is a pretty frequent connection that you get in dream work, where houses stand in for the psyche, right? You go down to the basement, it's unconscious. You're going up here, it's more conscious. It's right. And specific rooms, as we've discussed before, have specific valences. A kitchen is a space of transformation. A bathroom is a space of privacy, but also examination, right? Bedroom is a place that we sleep, but also a place of vulnerability, and so on and so forth, right? So, I'm assuming that people have read Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And so I don't want to elaborate on that too much more because it's sort of in the text and because I suspect that this will be touched on to a significant extent by other people. But it's interesting to bear in mind when we're talking about this. Now, towers, more generally speaking, are sort of fascinating when you consider them in sort of symbolic terms, in sort of mythological terms. I don't recall where I first came across this idea, but, the idea was that basically if you look at any given sort of period or phase in history, the tallest building also signifies the center of power in the culture. So at one point, the tallest buildings, right, were churches, cathedrals, church steeples, right? And you would get, in France, you'd get intergenerational projects to build a cathedral. This was something that an entire town and generations of people were involved in, this long-running project to build a house for God. They weren't going to live in it. It was a place of worship, but, right, adorning it, constructing it, and making it huge was something that was highly valuable. It marked, it was the tallest thing, closest to the heavens, right? Okay, and then later, right, we start to enter a modern period and a period of sort of nation states and so on and so forth, and the tallest buildings suddenly are government, right? The civic state, government becomes the tallest buildings. Well, what are the tallest buildings now? Corporations. Corporations have the tallest buildings. Here in Toronto, of course, we have the freest tall standing structure in the world. Used to be the tallest freestanding structure in the world, but that hasn't been the case for a while. But it is still the freest tall standing structure in the world, the CN Tower. But the CN Tower right off the bat, right? It's pretty cool, and it's an interesting sort of like anchor, right, for the city. I use it for navigation. I have a terrible sense of direction. So if I can see the CN Tower, I know kind of which way to go, right? And it's easy to see. It's handy for that kind of thing. And it's a corporate structure. I mean, it's the CN Tower. It's associated with a railway, right? Canadian National Rail. That it's a corporate structure. And corporate buildings are sort of the tallest buildings. This is a given, right? Every once in a while, a city will get into its head that it's going to build the tallest building in the world. And you get this shifting around, right? But typically that is like a corporate undertaking. It's right? You don't see this so much happening with, you know, religions deciding to build the tallest building in the world. You don't so much get it with governments deciding to build the tallest building in the world. There's been this shift in the power center. Now, tall building is a remarkable thing. If you don't have a distaste for heights and you get up into a very tall space, the ability to see tremendously far is itself slightly mind-altering, right? It gives you a weird sense of scale. Being up a very high mountain has a similar kind of feeling. And I've told you guys before about sort of the most beautiful experience I ever had, which was when I was in India, and we took a car with a driver up into the Himalayas. We were staying in Dharamshala, McLeod Ganj, near the Tibetan community in exile, so up North India in the Himalayas. And so we had to drive for hours and hours on these narrow roads, really not barely wide enough for one car, much less two, much less cars and the full-size trucks, right? And with large sections that had no guardrail, like you could look off the side and, you know, 3,000 feet underneath you, you could see like burnt out cars that had gone off the side. And yeah, yeah, the person I was with at the time spent much of that like white knuckling, you know, digging her fingers into my leg. And it was pretty hairy. Our driver also did not have a lot of experience driving under these conditions, despite what we had been told. And so, you know, it was pretty hairy. And we arrived after driving through the night, right? Multiple checkpoints, men with machine guns and mustaches, and having to bribe people and all the stuff that you have to do when you're traveling like that. And so we finally got to our house up there in the morning, and we were absolutely nuked. I handed a big chunk of cash off to the driver. I was like, thank you, thank God we're alive, thank you, please get something to eat, relax. And we got inside, and the people who were sort of tending the house, we had rented this Australian journalist's house, lovely place, quite high up in the mountains. And so, you know, he offered to make us chai, and so we had a nice chai. And people decided to go to bed, and I was like, I'm going to stay up for a little bit. I'm going to have a gin and tonic, a couple gin and tonics, and I'm just going to like have a gin and tonic and relax. And so I sat out on the balcony, and we were high enough up in the mountains that you could see off the side of the balcony down to the town underneath you. So there's a town, like a little toy town, far beneath you. But also, this amazing experience on this first day, there was a thunderstorm coming in, and the thunderstorm was underneath us, rolling up the side of the mountain. So it was shot through with periodic lightning and thunder, right? Big dark cloud, right? That rose up the side of the mountain and sort of enveloped the town in lightning. But it was beneath us. And the air above, perfectly crystal clear and filled with these tiny yellow and white butterflies. It was beautiful, right? Just like astoundingly kind of beautiful, but also obviously pretty mind-altering in a way. Like it hit me, you know, it was one of these moments where I was like, is this even real? Is this even happening? It was one of those kinds of moments, right? This almost seems too something to quite be real, but it is real, right? And a big part of this was the height. It was the looking down. Getting the same sense when you're up in a really high place in a high tower, it's mind-altering, right? This is why, you know, you'll see these kinds of religious structures quite commonly, right? So Aztecs, for instance, had, right, step pyramids. And one of the rites that was involved was that the king and queen, who were also sort of the high priest and high priestess, would ascend this thing. And if you've ever looked at the steps on this, I mean, there's no guardrail. It's quite vertiginous, right? It's quite vertigo-inducing. So you're ascending, and then you're getting out above this high place, and you can imagine there's a crowd of people, and you're engaged in a variety of other mind-altering rites, right? Because you throw things into a fire and inhale the smoke, and there's this business with dragging a rope embedded with thorns through a hole in your foreskin to cause blood, and you're sleep deprived, and you're sex deprived, and you're food deprived, and like all of these other things, right? Which are contributing to this. But then a big part of it is also this vertiginous sense of height. It's godlike. And when I say that, I mean that it's like it is the perspective that the heavens have to be able to look down and see and survey, right? Now, humans have got this, I think, programmed in us pretty deeply. It's one of the reasons why we like being close to trees. I think the leftover arboreal chunks of our monkey brain are like, great, trees, and we can go up them if we have to, if a threat suddenly comes in. But this idea of, I mean, some people are terrified of heights, obviously, but for many people, that sense of height induces a kind of state of awe and distance. It makes the world beneath toy-like, right? It's a shift in construal that renders space very different. You have this enormous range of vision, and yet things are toy-like, right? They look like ants, or they look like whatever. It's quite altering, the tower. Now, the tower turns up, interestingly, symbolically, in a lot of ways, right? So you get the ivory tower, right? They always refer to academia. I don't know where this ivory tower is. I mean, I know I'm not exactly what you call a mainstream academic, but I don't know where this ivory tower is. I'd love to find it, because they're always like, academics in your ivory tower. It's like, man, I wish. I wish there was an ivory tower. I live on the 29th floor, and I filled it with books. This is the closest approximation I've got, and the outside is red brick. So there we go. But, you know, there's this idea, right? The ivory tower, right, is a particular kind of idea. Rapunzel in her tower as a space of imprisonment, right? So Rapunzel has the long hair, but the point is she's imprisoned in a tall tower. There's a good book, actually, short book by Stephen King called The Eyes of the Dragon, in which, without saying too much, there is a character who ends up imprisoned in a high tower, and a good chunk of the book is about escaping from this tower. It's really quite good, and it's a quick read. Yeah, it's one of his underrated books, in my opinion. It's just a fantasy novel, like a short fantasy book, but atypical in the fantasy mold. It's quite good. But a big part of it is about being trapped in this high tower. And you can see that there are other places that the tower as this thing figures in. So one example of this is the Tower of Babel. Right, the Tower of Babel. So what's the story of the Tower of Babel? Right, this is in Genesis. And basically, it's that human beings, right, had gathered, and they decided that they were basically going to build a tower to reach heaven. Right, they were going to try to build this tower to reach heaven. They'd gotten the basics of architecture down, and now they were going to build this tower to reach heaven, using slime as their mortar and bitumen. So they brought stones and they started, mortaring the stones together and going up. And as they're building this thing up, God swoops in and he talks to the other angels and he says, we can't have this, right? This is no. We can't have this. This is, they're not in their place, right? So we can't have it. So he went down and he's like, let us go down and confound their tongues. So the idea, of course, is that prior to this, all human beings spoke one language. They spoke the speech of Adam, right? And there is a scene in Genesis where God brings all of the animals and stuff in front of Adam and has Adam give them names. The Adamic speech is, in some sense, and of course the universe is created through a speech act. God said, let there be light. So this idea of the language component is very powerful. The names that Adam gives to things when God brings them in front of him has a certain special and unique power, and there's only supposed to be the one language at the outset. Yeah, a certain special, unique power. Incidentally, this is actually an area where I have sometimes, said that sort of there's a basis of science in here, is basically what I'm getting at. There are all these other commandments, thou shalt not this and thou shalt not that, but there are some original commandments, right? And one of them is like, name all the things, right? This name all the things, I'm going to bring you the things and you should name them, is something that God does with Adam early on. And in my opinion, that's a big part of what's going on in science. Let's name all the things, right? Let's name all the things, while remaining a loose sense of the reality of those words. But this is not so in this myth. In this myth, the language of Adam as an original and powerful language has a real reality to it. So when they're building the Tower of Babel, and God and the people that he's talking to, that are presumably other gods or angels, go down and confound their tongues so that nobody can communicate with each other. And that breaks the project completely, right? They can't communicate, so they can't work effectively. And eventually the tower is broken and scattered so that no two stones rest atop each other, right? It's completely scattered. And likewise, humans are scattered across the earth with a babel of tongues, right? This is the Tower of Babel. So our language is scattered. Interestingly, if you are sort of interested in this sort of thing, there's a terrific book by Umberto Eco. I've been doing a lot of Umberto Eco recommendations, but Umberto Eco has this terrific book called nonfiction, called The Search for the Perfect Language, in which he discusses this idea, but then discusses all of the attempts over the centuries to recover the original speech, because people were like, if we can recover the Adamic tongue, it'll be magical or something in some way. It's going to have special powers. And so there were all these interesting attempts to try to figure out what the original tongue was, or to reconstruct the original tongue. Right? Lots and lots of sort of medieval projects in this regard to reconstruct the Adamic speech. That's what the book is about. And then it carries on to other things, like how this inspired the German philosopher Leibniz to try to develop a language in which it was impossible to lie, this kind of thing. But anyway, the Tower of Babel, it's a kind of storming of heaven, right? It's like a storming of heaven. Okay. And now let's consider for a second the tarot card, the Tower. Right? This is a really significant one. The tarot card, the Tower, depicts, right? I mean, there are variations, as there are with all tarot imagery, but it depicts a tower which is broken. It's been struck by lightning, and there's flames emerging from it. So there's a bolt of lightning that has broken it, and somebody is tumbling from the upper window. Okay. And it is meant to be this kind of sudden breaking in disaster, right? The tower's got this idea. It's very much a reference to Babel, right? But there's the tower is sort of going up, and this represents a certain kind of endeavor, and boom, the whole thing is broken into, right? The lightning of God, right? Often there is an eye also in the background, which is sort of like this, right? The looming eye of God in the image. There's a lot of different variations on this. I probably should have downloaded some, but you can look it up yourself. Just Google tower, right? The Tower, tarot. And you'll see numerous variations on this thing, like the lightning struck. This idea of something that suddenly, boom, breaks in, right? You've got your human endeavor going, and all of a sudden, boom, it breaks in, is a very significant kind of archetypal idea. In the modern context, there's a very striking image that this closely resembles. This is the image of the Twin Towers being struck on 9/11. Now, for many of you, this is sort of less significant because you've just grown up in the cauldron of post 9/11 stuff, right? It's like for a lot of you, maybe you weren't conscious when it happened, or, you know, like it doesn't have the same kind of salience. But, you know, that was, what was that, 20 years ago? So it was 20 years ago, and obviously it was a huge deal. It represented this, like a massive sense of incursion. It was in fact a rupture in people's sense of space and place. Wait, this is happening in New York? Like, what do you mean? And this idea that just out of nowhere, something that had been sort of a symbol of wealth and freedom and travel and agency and option, an airplane, could suddenly come in and smash into the World Trade Center, which at one time it had the distinction of being one of the tallest buildings in the world and signified trade. Like, and it was happening on Wall Street. Like, these are centers of a tremendous sort of aspect of the economic sense of identity and the American sense of power, right? And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, boom, and there's smoke and fire pouring out of the side of this thing. And the image that you see on the card, there is somebody who's tumbling headlong from the window of the tower as it breaks. And this was strikingly similar to the quite tragic and horrific images that you saw of people hurling themselves from the tower when it was struck, as people did. Really awful footage. Yeah, that breaking in, that Durchbruch, that like reality has other ideas, quality to the card of the tower is somewhat central to what this is about, right? You've got your own project going on. No. Let us, boom, let us drop it in. And you have had this feeling, I guarantee it, right? Because reality has two slightly paradoxical qualities to it, right? That we're always in tension around. It is at once the thing that you expect and the unexpected. This is how you gauge what is real. If something doesn't meet your expectations, you deem it to be real, right? Because you don't want reality to simply conform to your expectations. If it's too closely conforming to your expectations, it seems too good to be true, or it seems whatever, like there's something about that. We expect reality to exceed our model of reality, right? But we also expect it to conform to our model of reality, right? If something doesn't meet our expectations, that throws us. But also if it, sorry, let me start this out. If something does not meet our expectations, that throws us, right? And it seems not quite real. But if something completely meets our sense of expectations, that also throws us, right? We have these two ideas about the real. The real is both that which is expected, but also that which breaks through those expectations, right? Radically breaks through those expectations. It's also the real, right? There's a paradox in this. And this lightning bolt, the tower is building up, boom, right? And we are suddenly in free fall. That is at the essence of a certain kind of reality, a slightly terrifying kind of reality, because, right, man makes plans and God laughs, right? But you have had this experience. You probably had it significantly this whole fucking year, right? Because this year for many people was a kind of lightning bolt. Where did it come from? Well, I mean, in some ways, actually, it was completely anticipatable. We've known about zoonotic viral transfer for quite some time. Lots of experts have been talking about the fact that we were sort of overdue for a global pandemic. There's been lots of talk about the interconnection of society. There's lots of talk about how environmental destruction tends to bring, right, zoonotic organisms into closer contact because animals leave their habitats, and, right, the destruction of space and place, in fact, tends to kind of cause this sort of breakthrough. So experts sort of knew what was happening, and yet it caught everybody by surprise, honestly. Even the people who knew that it was coming, it caught them by surprise. There was a business as usual kind of approach to things. Everything was on rails when you could believe it, right? And probably you have some misgivings, but a lot of the time we've just operated according to some kind of normalcy bias. Oh, this is the way reality is. Is it? Is it the way reality is? Reality hasn't been like this for most of history, like this. It hasn't been like this. And it isn't like this for most people. Is this the way it is? But we all adjust to it, right? Everything's going to go back to normal. What's normal, right? What's normal? We constructed a kind of tower, right? We constructed a kind of tower and endeavored in some way to like storm heaven, to the extent that we settled into that, right? And that we got this idea that's like, no, we're masters of our own destiny, right? We know what the plan is. There's a plan. Is there? Boom. How'd your plan go? And that, in part, right, I think explains why so many people in confronting this have felt such tremendous anxiety. It's not just that there's a virus. It's not just that there's lockdown. It's that what this has done is demonstrate that the world on rails, oh, don't worry, we know exactly what we need to do. Don't worry about it. Just follow the rules. It's like, wait a second. You didn't know about this. You didn't control this. And that leads you into some uncomfortable places, right? Because either you can deny it, you can engage in denial, but that gets increasingly hard as it goes on, or you can, sort of reconcile yourself to the idea, oh my God, nobody's in charge, or the forces in charge certainly aren't sort of like human, right? And it's like, uh-oh, nobody's at the wheel, right? And that's anxiety provoking if you have a commitment to this business as usual kind of thing. Or you can decide, no, somebody is at the wheel. This is planned. And that, effectively speaking, leads into sort of conspiratorial thinking. There is a pattern. It is planned. It's planned malevolently, but at least it's planned, right? Somebody's in charge. It's just that they're bad guys. And that, again, immediately creates a kind of sense of place because you're an underdog and you're fighting against it, right? And that's quite common to sort of large C conspiracy. Small C conspiracy is obviously real. I mean, I've talked about this in a bunch of times. Small C's conspiracy is real. Watergate is a real thing. And in fact, sort of the revelation of these small C conspiracies is, I think, a big part of what has sort of primed the pump for the public, is they've realized how much stuff is actually hidden, right? There are secret government programs. That's a thing, but a lot of that is typically more mundane, right? So like Loblaws lost a case and had to send a $15 gift card to everybody. Why? They were engaged in a small C conspiracy to do bread price fixing. Well, that's not the kind of thing typically that people are interested in. They're interested in lizard people, right? It's a larger scale kind of mythological explanatory structure that snaps meaning into place, right? But small C conspiracies are a thing. There are, in fact, actors manipulating things. If any of you followed Wall Street Bets and GameStop, it was a very interesting naked revelation on the part of sort of the powers that be. Say what you will about the various people that piled into that. But if you followed it, It's like for a second, the velvet glove, the illusion of participation came off, and they were just like, no, 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 right? Well, that's conspiracy, small c conspiracy, right? There really are government programs. That's real. I've been talking about echelon for years, right? Years and years and years. Basically, when my friends thought I was nuts. Where it would be like, well, you know, the government like monitors everything, right? The NSA monitors these communications. They have automatic recording, and people would be like, okay, tinfoil hat. Well, of course, all of that is quite true. It's now subsequently it's been revealed through a set of like leaks, right? That's what Edward Snowden got nailed for. Edward Snowden got nailed for sort of leaking like, hey, just to let you know, everything is being watched, everything is being paid attention to. But even still, those are small c conspiracies. I bet they wish they were big c conspiracies, but they're not. Because if they were, they would have more control. And so the answer from the perspective of trying to bring this back into an orderly state of control is to say, no, 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 this is the plan. See, this is the plan. And of course, information-rich environment, confirmation bias, you can always find reasons. Now, are there small c conspiracies operating inside of it? Maybe, right? There are definitely some drug companies, for instance, that released, you know, oh, we think we've found something in a vaccine, and watch their price bump. That's not an accident, right? Whether or not they had something. It's like that's a bit of stock market manipulation. So these little gambits, of course, that people engage, but that's different than the great big C. Our tendency to move in that direction and to want to bring a sense of like imposed order, don't you see the picture? Don't you see the picture? Is like, I can impose an order on things. And it's a desire basically to repair things after the lightning bolt comes in. Because the lightning bolt has come in, and this is increasingly happening to us, right? Our sense of domicile collectively is rooted in a large part in time. This is the notion of future shock, which I talked about before, right? So culture shock, you relocate to another culture, and you don't have that sense of place. You don't understand the distance you're supposed to communicate at. You don't understand the unspoken codes involved, right? And you feel weird and alienated. But eventually you start to settle in a rhythm there. Then you try to go home and you feel weird and alienated from your original culture code, and you're trapped in a space between them. That's culture shock, right? It can happen with immigration, and it can happen with long-term visitation, right? In small doses, it's kind of fun, which is one of the reasons people like to travel. But like as an ongoing state of affairs, it just leaves you feeling profoundly unrooted and unanchored, right? It's alienating. It creates that sense of like, I have no sense of place, right? It takes us time to adjust. And the thing with Alvin Toffler's notion of future shock is that we are all, because of the nature of time and change and technological progress and social change, et cetera, living in a very different world, in a very different land than the one that we were born into, and we can't go home. Again, call back to the kind of cosplay golden age fascist, let's go back, let's go back, let's go back, right? There's a desire to go back. Now, most of you are probably not quite old enough to start experiencing the really keen sense of nostalgia that starts to accompany this, like this desire to attach somehow to the past, to root yourself in the past. Hollywood figured it out, which is why everything is like Transformers, and it's all childhood properties, right, that are sort of caught back up to capture that sense of like, are things moving too fast? Here's something you recognize, right? And so the sense of being constantly displaced forward, of having domicile, of not having a sense of place in time, right? That the social arrangements that you come to are, or that you exist in, are constantly outstripping what you came up in. And at a certain point, if you can't maintain plasticity, you begin to feel intensely alienated, right? What is cool and hip and the language and stuff, you're not picking it up anymore. That's a common experience. I experience it too, although I consider myself to be a quite high openness person. I try to maintain a sense of curiosity. I don't have an unselective palette, so I'm very selective about which aspects of the incoming I take, right? I take kind of an Amish perspective, right? That's one of the reasons I don't have social media, for instance. I'm not convinced that I need what it offers me, and it looks like the downsides, or it has always looked to me like the downsides are sort of higher, the cost is higher than what I'm willing to pay. I was a very slow adopter on mobile phones, similar kind of reason, right? Other technologies I adopt very readily. So this idea of being disjointed from time is like being disjointed from space. And this, you think everything is going along, boom, that experience. You can pick it up in the pandemic, but it will have happened in your own life. You'll have been on track, or maybe you haven't had this experience, but odds are you will. You'll be on track, and all of a sudden, boom, something hits. It can even be a good thing. It can be badly disorienting to have a very good thing happen to you. Winning the lottery can actually be a profoundly disorienting and disjointing experience for people, right? You kind of wouldn't think so. You're like, wow, what's the downside of that? But actually, it can come in a lightning bolt, everything that they've got set up, right? Coming in all their arrangements, all their relationships, all that stuff is rocked. And even if it's not disruptive at that level, right? Just like a randomly good thing can violate somebody's expectation in such a way as to be quite disorienting. Boom. So, the card of the Tower. Okay, so that's a very brief overview. I'm going to keep it there as per my promise, because there are also 2 presentations this week. So I will see you guys this evening, and yeah, look forward to talking to you then.